I wanted to write about Lilith as the first woman, and to me, she would be equal, absolutely equal. She would be powerful. She would be what woman was before patriarchy decided that men were in charge. She has a mission, which is to reverse this terrible thing that's happened in the Garden of Eden, which is, an all-powerful God deciding that man is in charge of women, and that's her mission. She's going to overturn it.
Hey peeps, welcome to the Literary Lounge, where we have honest conversations with authors about life, literature, and the spaces in between. Today, I have a very special guest with me here who has transitioned from reporting on economic intricacies to penning fiction. Nikki Marmery here, the famous author of On Wilder Seas, and Lilith hails from Amersham in the UK, where she lives with her husband and 3 children. And today we are here to talk about her recent release, Lilith, which is causing a stir in the world of literature and fiction. Hi, Nikki. Thank you so much for joining me here for this discussion today. How are you doing?
I'm very well, and I'm delighted to join you, Elena. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you here with me here. I'm excited to talk about this book, Lilith, which I read, and I loved every bit of it. But before we delve deeper into the actual conversation and talk about Lilith, I'd like to share that Nikki's debut novel, On Wilder Seas, earned a spot on the shortlist for the Historical Novel Society's New Novel Award and also secured a place in the Wilbur and Niso Smith Foundation's Adventure Society Book Club. I haven't picked that book yet, Nikki, but I've heard that the plot is based on a true story. Could you help us understand more about that?
That's right. It's based on the story of a woman called Maria, who was the only woman on board Francis Drake's ship, the Golden Hind, when he circumnavigated the globe in 1579. And I was really drawn to her story because, in the UK, we grow up with stories of Francis Drake, being a great hero. And of course, he did some absolutely terrible things, which we do know about. But what I had never heard about was this woman who was on board his ship. And it just struck me how, this is the voyage of the Golden Hind, the circumnavigation, it's probably one of the most famous sort of exploration voyages in British history. You study it at school all the time, and yet no one ever mentions this really quite, for me, key fact that there was one woman on board this ship with 80 men. And she joined the ship from a Spanish ship, which Drake raided off the coast of as he was traveling up the coast of South America. He sort of was raiding Spanish towns and Spanish ships as he went. And he took from this ship what he usually took from ships, which is, all the treasure, food. He took a pilot to sort of navigate his way into the next port. And he took this woman. And we know very little about her, except she was of African descent. We don't know whether she was enslaved or not on this Spanish ship. It seems likely, but we don't know the details. But she joined, and we don't really know the circumstances in which she joined Drake's ship, because it's very, very unusual that he ever took women on board his ship. And she was there for 9 months. She was there for 9 months of his exploration, which means that she was a witness to Drake's exploration of North America. It means that she is the first, non-Indigenous woman in that part of Northwest America. It means she's the first woman in any English colony anywhere in the Americas. And she is certainly the first named Black woman that we know of in that part of America. So she, to me, is phenomenally important. She then remained on board for the crossing of the Pacific until she was abandoned on the other side of the Pacific on a desert island when she was heavily pregnant. So, this story, when I first heard it, filled me with absolute horror that this horrendous thing had happened to her, but even more so with the fact that she had been erased, because she seems to me very important to British history, because she's the flip side of the stuff we've always been told. Drake's a hero, colonialization, empire, all these things are sort of, wonderful things. Maria is the flip side of that, and she shows you, what the cost is, who pays the cost. The people whose lives are sort of wrecked and ruined by these men, traveling around the world and taking whatever they fancy. And so that's really what drew me to her story.
Wow, that's amazing, and I'm definitely going to pick that book up next. And that brings me to the discussion of the day about Lilith. And before we talk about Lilith in detail, and I start talking about the actual book, that's your book, uh, could you help our audience understand who Lilith is in history, in mythology, and who Lilith is from your perspective?
She's actually a very, very complicated character. I will try to distill it because she's probably the sort of the oldest continuous female archetype in myth, because she actually started life in Iraq 5,000 years ago, where the Lilith was a type of female night demon. And as with everything in mythology, these things sort of travel from culture to culture, and they shift and evolve on the way. And so by the sort of Roman period, in the Levant area, she was a sort of a demonic figure in a variety of cultures, most notably in the Hebrew culture. And from there, so at this point in time, she's still just a sort of a demonic female. Later on, in the early medieval period, she becomes identified as Adam's first wife in the Garden of Eden. And this idea comes about that this sort of demonic figure that at this point has thousands of years of history as a sort of a female demon, was originally Adam's first wife. But because she had sort of refused Adam's authority, because she sort of insisted on the fact that she was equal to Adam, she was sort of expelled from the Garden of Eden by God and becomes this demonic figure. And so that is really her sort of history. And I think in the modern day, she's best known as a Jewish demoness, sort of a demoness in the Jewish tradition. But she has roots sort of going back 5,000 years, and she kind of appears in various forms and guises in pretty much every culture that has their roots in the Levant and in West Asia. And she kind of appears, she pops up in all sorts of different guises, and she evolves and changes as it goes. But the inspiration for my book is very much this myth of her as Adam's first wife, which first appeared, the first written record of it is in the early medieval period, and in a sort of document that was written somewhere in the Middle East. But it's clearly an oral story before it was written down. So that's the sort of the inspiration for the story. She's Adam's first wife. She considers herself equal, and yet, and God, who is supposed to be the moral arbiter, throws her out of paradise for refusing to be, because she's sort of refusing man's authority. And that to me spoke a lot. It speaks a lot about misogyny in patriarchal religion. It speaks a lot about the very roots of, the Judeo-Christian idea, that is fundamentally not equal. Fundamentally, you have God at the beginning of the Bible saying, you're not equal. Man shall rule over woman. And that's what fascinates me, because that has been probably the most powerful story of all time. It has affected everything for women for, ever since that story was finalized in its current form around 500 BC. That is the story that has kind of taken over the world. And it's been catastrophic, for women, and for other people, and for the planet, in my opinion. So that's what drew me. I wanted to write about Lilith as the first woman, and to me, she would be equal, absolutely equal. She would be powerful. She would be what woman was before patriarchy decided that men were in charge. She has a mission, which is to reverse this terrible thing that's happened in the Garden of Eden, which is, an all-powerful God deciding that man is in charge of women, and that's her mission. She's going to overturn it.
And we explore all of these themes in your lovely book, Lilith. It's very interesting to see how you've started the book. The first 3 lines that caught my attention, which were, for women everywhere, be your own gods, your mother commands it. And then we also later see that you've used gods in a lowercase, and mother is capitalized.
Yes.
So was this on purpose, something that we witnessed later in the book also? And what was your thought behind these first 3 lines?
Well, I mean, it's very much on purpose, because the first 3 lines actually are inspired by a line that comes from Genesis, which is when the snake that is tempting Eve, who in my book is actually Lilith, says you must not eat this fruit, because then you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. And then later on you have Yahweh, God, when he chucks them out of paradise, he says, you shall, lest you be one of us. And this is kind of fundamental to the whole story. This is a God of absolute hierarchy, and he's a God of control and tyranny. He is very much in favor of this. He's in favor of the hierarchy of man over woman, man over the natural world, and of course everyone worshipping him in the right way. And that is fundamentally what the book is about. It's kind of fundamentally about, this is in my opinion, a bad belief system, because it's unfair, it's unequal, and it brings about all sorts of tragedies for people and the planet. So really it's about that. And my book is also about the one person who is missing, in Genesis, because we very rarely, we know this story so well, we very rarely question. We've got God the Father. Why is there a father without a mother? Because for all religions prior to this, you had a mother goddess who, obviously it was, human beings knew where new humans came from. They came from mothers. And in fact, they knew about this long before they knew what a father did. For many millennia, no one had any idea that men were involved in the whole process. Women magically produced new life, as though they were, magical beings. And, that is why for millennia, any conception of God was female, because that's what makes sense. That's what people knew. Women bring life into the world. And it's a step up from that to imagine, the higher being that brings life into the world is also female. But by this point, by the emergence of the first patriarchal societies, and it's not just, in the Jewish tradition, this is, everywhere in that part of the world, those mother goddesses start to disappear. And they disappear because, of course, patriarchy needs to present the idea that male authority is natural, and the ultimate authority is a male deity. So these mother goddesses start to disappear. But you can still see clues, about them throughout, all the way through the Bible. You can still see clues as to the existence of these. And in the Hebrew tradition, the mother goddess was Asherah. So you can still see clues about her all the way through the Bible, and nowhere more so than in Genesis, where the tree, the fruit, the snake, these are all very, very ancient symbols of the goddess. The snake was in the ancient world, across cultures, represented female wisdom and foresight. The tree represents sort of bringing forth, sustenance, regeneration, and the fruit represents fertility, which is the goddess's primary function. So, when I sort of start, to get back to your original question, what are those words about? They are to sort of remind people about the mother, the original mother, who has been erased from this story, and her very different worldview, the worldview that we have been deprived of, in my opinion, for several thousand years. You have the worldview of the father, who says, do as I tell you. I'm in charge of this hierarchy. You will do what you're told. He issues commandments. And the worldview of the mother, who's got a very different worldview. She's not at all bothered about her children becoming like one of us. She doesn't mind. She wants her children to surpass her. She loves her children. She wants them to grow. And she is very happy with the idea of her children replacing her in time. The God the Father isn't, and that's why he wants to evict his children from paradise. But the God the Mother, she's cool with that. And that is the sort of message of my book, really, that the mother, and she can represent whatever you want, wants you to learn to be your own gods, to stop inventing people who tell you what to do, who tell you how to behave, which always by some mysterious function happens to be the way that people in power want you to behave. God the Mother has a very different message, and her message is about wisdom. It's about learning how to live in the world. It's about learning to appreciate the world. It's about harmony, equality, regeneration, all these things that are very much rooted in this one world that we have. And she is saying, be your own gods. You don't need this You don't need this tyranny. So that is a very long-winded way of saying why that is at the beginning of the book.
But that's a very, very powerful message, because it puts the reader in the mind of what they're going to read next in the book. Okay, so this brings me to my next question, which is how did you come up with the character of Lilith being, this heroine that women have waited for 6,000 years? And instead of something that we've heard in mythology, that, she's a demoness and she is a thief and she steals babies and all things like that. How did you come up with her character? What was the thought process behind that?
Well, I think whenever you read, I'm very fascinated by all ancient myths, and especially, across this whole region. Whenever in myth you come across stories of demonized women, whether that's Lilith in Hebrew myth or Medusa in Greek myth, what you will always find at the root of that before they get demonized is a powerful woman. And the reason they're demonized is that these stories are written by men, and they are written with a purpose. And the purpose is to bring down and demonize powerful women. All of, Medusa originally, was a goddess in sort of pre-Hellenic mythology. And, that every single woman who is demonized in this way started off with power. And that's why she's being demonized. So, when I see the character of Lilith and, I see that she's a baby killer and, she's all these things that men are afraid of, she's a threat to family life. She's supposed to sort of steal, she's supposed to stop, she steals babies from pregnant women. She seduces men, against their will at night. All of these things are a threat to family life, but they're a threat to men. And that's why she's demonized, for women, and if you look at the sort of, the aspect of her as the first woman, the equal woman, I mean, what's not to love, so whenever I come across an ancient myth, I try to strip away the male gaze from it, because, everything we have that's from recorded history is from the male point of view. You have to sort of strip away at it, and you have to look at what might have come before. What was the story that they are deliberately trying to hide? And you have to strip that away. And it's an imaginative, process, of course. I've got, there's no way of knowing what came before, but you can imagine from little clues. And so that's where she came from. She, to me, is powerful. She's the first woman, and she's a metaphor, really, for what women were, before they were all demonized, before we had all of these sort of, stories, about women being duplicitous and dangerous and treasonous, and who must never have authority. These are the stories of patriarchal men. They're no good. We've had enough of those. We've had those for 7,000 years. Let's go back to the original stories about women, which is that women are powerful. They bring life into the world. They do something absolutely phenomenal with their bodies. Not only do they bring life into the world, if they choose to, and that is a crucial point, it must be their choice. Not only do they bring life into the world, but they also sustain, in the same way that the earth sustains people, mothers sustain their babies. And it's an incredible thing. And I think the only reason we don't think of it as incredible is that we've had, 7,000 years of this sort of, propaganda that men start life, that men create life, and women are merely vessels. They're unimportant, and those are the stories I want to strip away.
That resonates with the current ideology of women as well. I mean, so much that, even today, women are fighting for equal rights, equal pay, equal, work. They're not getting that. Even today, after all these years, and women have been fighting for their rights, and not only in the US or in the British, but also in India. I mean, people have been fighting for their rights even after they have kids. They need maternity leaves. They have to fight so much to get particularly that, and the question of being a father is never there. I mean, people don't even care about it. They don't even think twice about it. But when there's women involved, they always think about when she's coming back from maternity leave, whether she's, in a stable mind enough to get back to her job as well as she would have been if she did not have a child. And there are so many things involved with that. That ideology still exists. And it's very disheartening to see that, in a world that's progressing at such a rapid pace, we women need to make a lot of efforts, a lot more efforts than men would have to.
Absolutely, and but I think this is all the legacy of a really incredibly long period of time when everything we know about the modern world, everything in the modern world was made by men who believed they had the right to rule over women. Everything was made for men's convenience and benefit, and women had no input in that. When you're thinking about sort of systems of legislature, how governments work, how the world works, women were deliberately excluded while all these things were being built. We had no input into them, so nothing is from our point of view. Everything is from the male point of view. And even in parts of the world where women did have power, and there's some incredible matriarchal societies in India, for example. Even in those places where there were little pockets where women had power, along comes the sort of the colonial megalith, and sort of wipes them all out and imposes this sort of the European centric male over women hierarchy. So we've got this legacy, and it's it's the most successful. Patriarchy is the most successful model of social organization there has ever been. It's phenomenally successful, and it's 7,000 years old. That is not something that you can overturn in a generation or two. It's going to take a really, really long time, and I don't think that should be depressing. I think what's depressing is to think, well, women, thinking about the UK, for example, well, women have been, equal in law for at least, 30 years, you might, depending on what you want to base it on. Why are we still sort of fighting? Of course, we're still fighting these things. It's not the last 30 years. We've got to overturn 7,000 years of this stuff. Of course, we're still fighting, and we will be for a really, really, really long time until we have a world that is absolutely equal, in which women contributed to all the sort of systems that are devised, until things have been designed with women's input on an equal basis. I'm not advocating that women completely take over and organize everything from their point of view, as men did for so long, even though we deserve to. I'm advocating a world in which women have equal input, and that is the world that I think we should all be fighting for, men as well, but it will take a really, really long time. But
Absolutely.
So be it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm okay with like the fight that's going on, and I think we now see a lot of women also advocating feminism and fighting for their rights, standing up, the ones who were not given the opportunity before, but today they know about their rights more, and they're standing up for themselves, fighting for their rights, speaking up for themselves and their kids on the larger front, which I mean. I would like to divert a little bit here and talk about the concept of paradise and Sheol that you have mentioned in the book, heaven and hell in common terms, that we have all heard of ever since we were kids. Where then did the theory of paradise being a place on earth emerge from?
This is a really fascinating question, Lena, because it's quite complicated. I'll try and sort of distill it. But sort of in Christian beliefs, when we think of sort of Christian beliefs of heaven and hell, that seems like completely part of Christianity, but that wasn't there at the start. Early Christians didn't believe in hell. They didn't really believe in that in a sort of a heaven either. What they did believe was that in Jesus, when in the first century AD, they believed that Jesus would come back and he would literally resurrect physically dead bodies. And that would bring about this idea of this sort of paradise on earth. But even in that really early period, there was a wide diversity of belief. Until Christian doctrine was sort of formalized, 300-400 years later, there was some really wide divergence of opinion. For example, the resurrection, which we consider today to be absolutely fundamental, the one thing that all Christians can agree on. There were Gnostic sects in the 1st century AD who didn't think that was supposed to be taken literally. They thought that the resurrection was a metaphor for sort of acquiring wisdom and being born into a new life, a physical, real life. So, there's this sort of very wide divergence of opinion, and that really is sort of the idea that I wanted to explore in that sort of section of my book where Mariam, who is my prophet, she's Mary Magdalene, and her partner Yeshua, which is the Aramaic form of Jesus, what they're preaching is not an afterlife in heaven. What they are preaching is a paradise on earth. But the paradise on earth that they're talking about comes from understanding the wisdom of the mother. And there are sort of reasons to think that the real, the historical Jesus was bringing a message from a sort of a female goddess. And I can sort of go into that in a bit. But that's really the inspiration for this part of the book. And so, Mariam and Yeshua want to bring about a paradise on earth by this creed, this creed that they've been sort of, that Lilith, in fact, has been trying to sort of spread, for 4,000 years at this point, and she will carry on spreading it for another 2,000 years, which is this idea of the wisdom that is rooted in nature, a wisdom about equality, about harmony, about regeneration in this world, not a sort of internal spiritual life somewhere else. And that's, really important because it's about recognizing that life is something that we have on this earth. It's not something, that this earth isn't a waiting room. It's not a waiting room, it's not something really unimportant before an eternity in some better place. Mariam and Yeshua are saying there is no better place. This is the better place, but you have to make it a better place. And the way you do that is by sort of promoting these ideas of equality, of harmony, and regeneration in this earth. And the alternative is this idea of a heaven where you're going to be judged, and if you behave, you'll get to this afterlife, a spiritual afterlife. It's sort of like an eternity of non-physicality, which to me, is not very appealing personally. But it's also about that mind-body split, which we see a lot in patriarchal religion, the idea that the mind and the body are separate and that the mind is superior to the body, whereas, sort of ancient religions, sort of goddess worshipping religions, were very physical. They were very much about the physical world and the physical body, which to me feels much healthier, a sort of a recognition of reality, of physicality, which is really the source of, for me, everything that's wonderful in life, feeling the sun on your face, physical love or being with friends. Those are the sources of joy for me. And so really it's about that. It's about sort of getting rid of that idea of judgment, of eternal life if you behave, which is a control mechanism. That's the way that people control other people. It's very, very appealing to people who seek power over other people, which is why it's so successful, because it's been used time and time again by people in power, by states, by people who sort of want to control other people and get other people to do what they want them to do, whether that's invade another country or any other sort of nefarious activity. It's a very, very, very appealing control mechanism. But the route out of that and the route to a happier life is getting rid of all of that, getting rid of the control mechanism, believing in, the joys and the wisdom that comes from the natural world. So that's that's a complicated way of saying.
But that makes a lot of sense, because it's not only in Christianity that we see this concept of heaven and hell. We also see this in Islam. We also see this written in scriptures, where there's this concept that there's a heaven where you're going to reach if you're good in this world, and then there's a hell. And there are a lot of anecdotes about that in the scriptures as well. And then we're time and again told that, you need to do this to reach heaven. And then if you don't do this, you're going to hell, which is again a control mechanism in your words. And this is very, very enlightening, honestly, because if people start looking at it like this, they'll actually understand that, all of this is just a power game. I'd say that, they're just trying to control your senses, your consciousness, for that matter, that you'll start making decisions like that from the very beginning if you just read about all of this like that.
Yeah, and it's very, patriarchy as a sort of a social model, which is, which is essentially the rights of the father. It's not really. It's about men and women, obviously, but more specifically, it's about the rights of the father over the mother and the children. And you can see why a system like that needs that control mechanism. It needs that control. It's a hierarchy. It needs hierarchies need to be enforced. It needs that control system. So you can see why this idea of a punishing hell evolved. You can see why the idea of an eternal heaven evolved. But I think they're both very, very damaging. I think they're damaging to our relationship with this one earth that we have. I think that if we're thinking about something else, it takes, focus away from making life better on this earth, which is, in my opinion, what we should be doing.
That's very true. And I think it's very beautifully explained in your book as well, the contrast between paradise and Sheol and what happens. And I think that readers will have to explore that more in the book when they read it. And moving on, you've explored, we've talked about Christianity a fair bit. And I'd like to note that the significance of Lilith in Bible or other Catholic scriptures is close to zero. I mean, we find instances in some places, but it's not clearly mentioned. In fact, while I was researching more about Lilith and what she is and where she comes from, I came across this website called Catholic.com, where there was a question on Lilith, who she is, and it was answered in a way which I'm quoting this directly, which said that Lilith is an element of Jewish folklore who is first attested to in a Dead Sea Scroll called Songs of the Sage. In that work, and in the later Babylonian Talmud, AD 300 to 500, she is described as a demon. The later medieval alphabet of Ben-Sira first describes her as Adam's wife. Lilith is not found in the sacred scripture or in the church's tradition, and so the stories about her being Adam's wife can be safely described as myths. If Lilith did find existence in the Hebrew mythology, do you think she was erased on purpose from the books that followed after the Christ, given how patriarchal ideologies have emerged?
Well, yes, there's certainly a lot of erasure of powerful female figures in early Christianity, but I think it's more about the fact that in this period, that sort of, I've talked a little bit about sort of Lilith's origins, that she starts off in Iraq as a demonic figure, and she sort of spreads to all of those cultures, and she's a demonic figure in the Babylonian Talmud, which, as you say, 300 to 500 CE, but she doesn't get associated with Adam. She doesn't get associated with the sort of biblical story of the Garden of Eden until quite late on, till about sort of 700 to 1000 AD. That's the first time she appears in a written record, directly linked to the story of the Garden of Eden. And she was, so that is in a Jewish text that she first appears, which is the alphabet of Ben-Sira. It's actually a satirical text. It's not a religious text at all. It's a sort of a satirical story. So we don't actually know. It's probably satirizing another story which has been lost. So we don't really know, how much of it was the original sort of oral story that it's sort of critiquing. But that's the first mention of her as Adam's first wife. And she was kind of simultaneously discussed in Christian scripture as well around that time. She's in a text called the Book of Adam and Eve, which is an Ethiopian tract, which is around the same time as the alphabet of Ben-Sira. It's 7th century Common Era. So she is in Christian scripture at this time. And it's really kind of after this period that, in fact, it's sort of Christian artists that start depicting her as the snake that tempts Eve in the Garden of Eden. And that, the most famous example of that is Michelangelo's version in the Sistine Chapel, which is a beautiful work of art. But there are many, many other depictions of her as well, sort of earlier than that. So sort of late medieval, early Renaissance. And that goes on until about the sort of 16th century. So those are in sort of Christian representations. But really, Christianity doesn't really need Lilith, because Christianity did such an incredible job of demonizing Eve. Lilith is small fry compared to what they did to Eve, and Eve is not really demonized in the Jewish tradition in the way that she is by Christians. From St. Paul, which is the 1st century AD, She's blamed for absolutely everything. She's blamed for bringing sin into the world. She's blamed for bringing death into the world. She is the reason that women must never be trusted, that women are duplicitous, they're treasonous, they must never have authority. You have St. Paul in the 1st century AD saying, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. She is to keep silent, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman who became the transgressor. Now that is 2,000 years old. And you then see, throughout the sort of medieval period, you see this sort of getting worse and worse and worse, the sort of real extremes of misogyny. You have Tertullian, this is shortly after St. Paul, you have Tertullian, who is a sort of, church leader in the 2nd century Common Era, who sort of famously says, that all women are Eve. Don't you know, he says, that you are all Eve. You are the devil's gateway. You are she who persuaded him whom the devil did not. So Eve is so demonized. And that kind of leads on really to the persecution of women as witches, because it's this idea that women are sort of open to evil. They're open to the devil in the way that Eve listened to the snake. It's not even a devil in the original story, it's a snake. The idea that women are open to evil, that they are easily tempted and easily seduced by evil, that leads to, the literal murder of, countless women as witches. So, Christianity did an absolutely brilliant job of demonizing Eve. They don't need, they don't need anyone else. And of course they do sort of demonize, other sort of characters as well. But Eve really gets the brunt of it, in sort of Christian theology from the very start, until really quite recently, which is kind of explains a lot about the misogyny that we are still living with. And I think especially in America, which has a very, very strong evangelical tradition, which believes that these stories are literally true, it explains a lot about misogyny in the Western world.
That makes a lot of sense. But in Lilith, the book that you've written, Eve does find her redemption. And I want to understand your perspective of writing the character of Eve. What were your thoughts when you framed her character?
Do you know what? I actually feel, since writing the book, I actually feel like I was a bit mean to Eve. Because she has been horribly demonized, as I said, and there are also sort of clues in sort of the original Hebrew wording of Genesis. There are clues that she was, again, I said that all demonized women start off as more powerful. There are clues that the original Eve was actually considered, a goddess, because there are sort of clues in the original Hebrew as to the way she talks when she has, when she conceives Cain. The way she, in the original, in the current version, it's very much God, who helps her get pregnant. But in the original, she says, "I have created a child with Yahweh," which kind of hints at this earlier power that the original Eve would have had. So I feel a bit mean about how I've treated Eve, but that was kind of necessary because my book is about Lilith, and I found Lilith to be the interesting character that I wanted to pursue. But I did very much have one representation of Eve in mind when I was writing, and it's the representation of Eve in Paradise Lost by John Milton, because that is a sort of a hugely influential work about the same story that I'm writing about, what happened in the Garden of Eden. And that view of Eve has kind of coloured a lot of our culture ever since. And in it, she's kind of pathetic, she's really weak and pathetic, and she just keeps going on about how much she loves Adam, and it's just a very, again, it's a very male view of a submissive woman. And so I had that very much in mind when I was writing it. And that's why my sort of Eve starts off as this sort of simpering, weak, sort of somewhat laughable character. But she does come out of that. She acquires wisdom through Lilith, I must say. She acquires wisdom and she becomes a stronger character. But I do feel I was a bit mean to Eve in the beginning, because she doesn't deserve it. Eve is Lilith's sister, after all. Eve is also a progenitor of the human race, and she has been horribly demonized by male theologians for 2,500 years, and she didn't deserve it.
Maybe we're yet to read more about Eve from you. Maybe the next book that you write about is Eve, and then we learn more about her character in detail and the various aspects of where she came from and why she was the way she was, and then what eventually happened.
Yeah, and I think it's easy to sort of one of the questions, actually, when I do book clubs, one of the questions I ask is, Lilith is very critical of Eve, because she's critical of Eve's decision to stay with Adam. Do you think is that fair? Or is she just making, the decision that she kind of has to make, because Adam's all she's ever known. Lilith has a memory of this time before when the Holy Mother was around, but Eve doesn't. And so she, is kind of in the position she's in through her circumstance, not because she's stupid or wrong or sort of pathetic. So yeah, she's kind of making decisions based on her own situation, which is different to Lilith's.
That's a very good question, honestly. I mean, I would ask everybody who's been reading this book to ponder on that and think on their own grounds why Lilith was mean to to Eve, and what was she thinking, and what could be an Eve's perspective here. That would be a great question for all. For people in my book club as well, when they're reading this book, because we're going to pick this up in February, and we're going to read this book definitely.
Oh, wonderful! I can't wait to. And people have very different responses to it, and I love hearing them, the good and the bad.
Definitely. I mean, of course, I would make sure that you get to hear more about a book club, and whatever they're saying, I'll share it with you as well.
That would be lovely, Alina. I'd love that. Thank you.
Okay, the next character that I'd like to talk about is Mary Magdalene, because she again is a very interesting character from a mythological point of view as well. And I remember a few lines from your book which said that one word, whore, was all that was needed to degrade Mariam in the millennia to come. Nothing else was required, which is very true when it comes to when you look at the historical perspective of how Mary Magdalene is treated and what you read about her on the internet and elsewhere. So what were your thoughts when you were shaping her character?
Well, again, I was hugely inspired by the Gnostic Gospels, which are these very early Christian scriptures that were buried for nearly 2,000 years. We kind of knew about them because there were other descriptions of them from other sort of texts from antiquity, but until 1945. No one had seen them. And in 1945, they were discovered in Egypt at a place called Nag Hammadi. And these texts, they were buried because they became heretical. And they became heretical because in the sort of 3rd, 4th centuries AD, the church decided to sort of create the orthodox version of Christianity. And, I talked before about the very diverse beliefs there were before that period. And then you have this sort of move to decide what is Christian doctrine and what isn't. And by huge coincidence, everything that kind of hints at sort of any sort of female divinity or female power or even female equality becomes heretical. What a surprise. And in these texts, you see a very different account of Jesus's life, of his disciples, of people's beliefs, and they are absolutely fascinating. I mean, some of them they're contradictory. They're not sort of a sort of a unified set of beliefs, but they're a set of documents that just give a completely different perspective of the early Christian era. And specifically, what they really do show, which is fascinating from my perspective, when I'm writing a book about female power and female divinity, is that Mary Magdalene is by far the most important disciple. She is far ahead of the male disciples in understanding what Jesus is saying. She is not only a disciple, but she's a teacher. They go to her for teaching because she has knowledge that they don't have. What it also shows is that there's a huge conflict between Mary and Peter. Peter despises Mary. He keeps asking Jesus to get rid of her. He is horribly misogynistic in these scriptures. he says women are not worthy of life. Whether he means by that women are not worthy of the new life that you're offering, or whether he means they're not worthy of life at all, we don't know, but that's what he says. And there is this sort of palpable conflict between Mary and Peter. And really that kind of really inspired me, because that's what I am writing about. I'm writing about this conflict between two opposing worldviews. The worldview of Peter, which is that women are inferior and unimportant, and certainly have nothing of any interest or importance to say when it comes to sort of religion or wisdom, anything like that. And the worldview of Mariam, which is the worldview of the goddess, which is that women are powerful, that women are certainly equal, that women are women's experiences and beliefs, the things that they do, these things can be considered divine, the bringing forth of new life. So you have this conflict between these two worldviews, and so that is what I wanted to explore in this part of the book. And secondly, we have quite a lot of evidence that in my book, I've gone further than what is suggested in the Gnostic Gospels, because I have Mariam and Yeshua as an equal partnership, and that really is to sort of represent the theme of my book, which is that what we've lost with the arrival of patriarchy, with the idea of this, the arrival of this idea that men should rule over women, is we've lost that possibility of partnership between men and women, which is, in my opinion, the ideal. That's the ideal power dynamic between men and women, and we've lost that. And so there were plenty of sort of other. Jesus wasn't the only sort of only prophet at that point in history. There were other prophets, and it was very common at that point for there to be a male and a female, to represent this idea of partnership, to represent the very, very ancient idea of the sacred marriage, which is the coming together of the male and the female, to create new life. And so that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to present that quite revolutionary, I suppose, idea that Yeshua was in partnership with Mariam, not, she's not his disciple, she's not under him. They are absolutely in this together, and they've got a message, and the message that they're trying to promote is this idea of equality, of partnership, of the wisdom of the goddess, as opposed to the father's message, which is a message of control and hierarchy. So that's what inspired me, and to be honest, I found this the most fascinating part of my research, and it is true that she, Mary Magdalene is clearly a very, very important figure in early Christianity. And the way we know this is that if the early the writers of the New Testament could have erased her, they absolutely would. But she's so important. She's obviously so important in the oral testimonies of the time that they couldn't get rid of her. So she's there still in the Bible as the first person who sees the resurrected Jesus. She is very, very, very rare in the Bible, in that she is a woman. She doesn't belong to any man. So you get hints of this importance that she clearly had. And because of that, she was denounced on the basis of absolutely no evidence. She was denounced by the Pope as a prostitute. On no evidence. And that is the sort of the time-honored way of reducing women, of dismissing them, of erasing them, questioning their morality, questioning their sexual purity, which is all a male construct anyway. That is the way of diminishing female power. We've seen it time and time again throughout history. That's what I wanted to counter. I wanted to present a powerful Mariam, she's quite a complicated character. She's not by all means, in many ways, she's extremely unlikable. She's very prickly, but she has got this passion. She has got this idea that she wants to promote, and she will do it. It's her sort of overriding obsession that this is what she will do at the cost of her life. And she is powerful, and she is wise, and she has something really important to say, which is very rare, of course, in patriarchal religion. You very rarely see women who've got something important to say.
That makes a lot of sense. But we also see this kind of partnership somewhere between Lilith and Samael. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name correctly, but we see a sort of partnership between them as well in the book, which is very interesting. And I want to speak to you about him next. What idea did you have when you were framing his character, and what thoughts were there? Because that again is a very, very interesting character in the book.
Yeah, well, Samael in the Hebrew tradition is the angel of death, and he is linked to Lilith in some of the sort of ancient texts as her partner, and and in the same way that Asmodai, who or Asmodeus, is their child. And so, but really, that's pretty much the only part I've really taken from ancient myth, is that connection. The reason he's so important in the book really is that his partnership with Lilith, which is an equal partnership, it's based on mutual love, attraction, respect, is for me the ideal, by which I don't mean that everyone should be striving for a heterosexual relationship. That's not what I mean. What I mean is the power dynamic between men and women, which is what my book is about. That is the ideal, this ideal partnership, not hierarchy. And that ideal is something to strive towards. For me, the alternative to patriarchy is not matriarchy. I don't want to see a world where women have absolute power over men, because I think ultimately that would go the same way. I think any power that people have over other power results in corruption. So if you had a scenario where women had absolute power over men, I think you'll see the same debasement occur, because power corrupts. The alternative to patriarchy is what we have not seen in this world for millennia, and that is partnership, equality, a true coming together of opposites, of a joining together of the two sexes in a way that is that is positive. You need the two sexes to create life. After all, it is the coming together of opposites from which new life happens. That's how you create life. And so it's that sort of coming together of male and female in partnership that I wanted to explore. And so Samuel is there, very much at the beginning of the book. He kind of sits out much of the middle of the book, and that's really because this is Lilith's story, and I want Lilith to pursue her own hero story. But it's very important that he's there at the end, because it is what they do together that is important. And the reason for that is not because I think everyone needs a partner. I don't, by any means. I think people are very happy on their own. I think people are very happy and hope, I'm not saying that a heterosexual relationship is the only sort of option at all by any means either. But because this is a book about the power dynamic between men and women, that is where it needs to end up. It needs to end up somewhere where they together have the key to what needs to happen to sort of reset history and start again in a better model of sex relations and power relations between men and women.
Right. I mean, we also see a contrast between what Lilith was with Adam in the very beginning, and then what Lilith becomes with Samael, the power that she gets with his confidence, with his support, and the kind of partnership that they both share. It shows us a contrast between the two kind of relationships. And that's very interesting also, that when you have equal partnership, this is the kind of relationship that it'll turn into. And when there's no equal partnership, and when there's only one predominant sex who just keeps saying that, you need to obey me, or you need to, I'm above all and I'm your authority, then the kind of relationship and the kind of thing that happens, it's very evident in the book. I mean, from where Lilith comes from. That journey is also very interesting to explore.
Yeah, I mean, for me, how can you have love without equality? How can you love someone who thinks they're better than you? That's horrible. That's not love, and it's so limiting, and it's damaging. The idea that that man is in charge of women, that man should rule over women, it eliminates immediately women's perspectives, experience. And we do have different, in my opinion, women do have different experiences of this world, because we're we exist in different bodies, and for so long, the male default has been thought of as, the male is the default human, and woman is just the other. But actually, that's not, obviously that's not what I think, but also that's not, how people thought of men and women before patriarchy. We have different bodies, and that does lead to different experiences. And I think women, it's the elimination of women's experiences and women's perspectives that has led to so many of the problems we see in the world, in my opinion. The unrestrained, masculine energy. I can see, there is men are more aggressive than women, and there is a natural, evolutionary reason for that. But it also means that without women, without that restraining element of women, if you have uncontrolled aggression, what do you get? Relentless war, relentless need to control other people, that relentless need, possession of other people, possession of land, possession, control. These are the things that have corrupted the world. And I think a big part of that is the absence of female authority and the absence of female input into government. That's my opinion. Other people may disagree, but that I think that absence of femaleness is disastrous for humanity.
I actually agree with that a lot. And I think we're seeing a shift in the modern world with this as well, with the character of Lilith becoming into something different. And I came across a site that said that Lilith has become such a popular figure that whole enterprises like the Women's Music Concert, Lilith Fair, and Jewish feminist journal Lilith magazine are named after her, which was surprising and very amazing to see. So once a source of fear, Lilith has been transformed into an icon of freedom. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I love that. And I think that's what I love most about mythology. I love the way it evolves. I love the way it takes on new meaning as people need it to. So you have this sort of original, for thousands of years, she's a demoness. And in fact, I should say later on in this interview, there's a brilliant book called Woman's Law by Sarah Clegg, which actually traces the evolution of the archetype of Lilith and other Lilith type mythologies. And her perspective is that the origin of this demonic figure who attacks pregnant women in childbirth is that it's about women's fears of pregnancy and childbirth, because of course pregnancy and childbirth was phenomenally dangerous until the advent of modern medicine. And so the idea that there is a sort of a demon that you can appeal to for safe passage of your pregnancy, a demon that's responsible, for the sudden death of your infant, which is the most, horrific thing any woman can face, kind of helps you feel like you're more in control. So you have that's possibly, and in Sarah Clegg's brilliantly argued book, that is a very convincing explanation for why this demonic figure emerges to do with pregnancy and childbirth. You then see that kind of get taken over by men, because now she becomes this sort of seductive figure. She's dangerous. She will sort of damage family life. She's a threat. So you then see that. You then see sort of, this association of her, with the devil, with the snake that tempts Eve. And again, that's a very male point of view. In Michelangelo's picture, it's very striking how you see this sort of female figure that in his head is evil, that is offering the fruit to another female. And it's a very, very, in my opinion, quite a misogynistic image, compared to his, just a few feet away is the image of the male god bringing life to Adam in exactly the same pose, positive male deity offering life, and then this evil female figure offering death to Eve. So you see all these ways in which she has been sort of interpreted by people. And of course, for the past, I think at the beginning you have this, they're female interpretations, then you have this long period where they're very male interpretations. And we're now emerging into a period where women are reclaiming that idea of Lilith. And I think it's absolutely brilliant. And, it started, in the 70s, Jewish feminists who reclaimed that idea of Lilith to represent, female power. And that's kind of it's kind of those sort of early Jewish feminists that we have to thank for the sort of the resurgence of Lilith. Otherwise, I think we probably wouldn't know much about her. You know, that's when she sort of emerged. And as you say, the magazine that's named after her, the Lilith Festival, which is a music festival in America. And you have these sort of very positive images of female power. She becomes a symbol of women's emancipation, of women's liberation, of women's freedom from men. A lot of the time, you know, she's often sort of interpreted in very sapphic terms. And, you know, I think all those things are absolutely brilliant. And I love the way that such an ancient idea, you know, which stretches back 5,000 years, can sort of be brought up to the present day and inspire modern women. I think that is absolutely wonderful. And she's, you know, so many different interpretations of her now. But I think for modern women, she is absolutely a positive role model. And that's because women are telling these stories now. You know, when men tell them she's this evil, horrible figure who kills children, when women tell them she's this sort of powerful, free spirit who escaped from the tyranny of Adam trying to rule over her, and found a life of freedom. And I think that's hugely inspiring.
I absolutely agree. I mean, it's very, very inspiring to see where Lilith has come from. Like, she was a demon. Originally, she wasn't. And then she was turned into this demon figure. And now she's finally getting her redemption in a lot of ways, that, you know, people are actually accepting her identity, and they're actually embracing freedom. And I love it when women take her as this symbol of freedom, and then they, you know, embrace themselves and their sexuality. And then they're like, you know, we are freer and we don't need other people to rule over us. I mean, we can decide for ourselves what's right and what isn't. And it's amazing to see where Lilith has come from. I also wanted to mention a few lines from your book. And again, I loved these few lines where you question the readers about what a different world would have been like, a world where there would have been equality, a world where both men and women were equal and both of them had equal right. And to quote your book, you mentioned that how would female power, female spirituality, female-centered philosophies have shaped the world had they not been suppressed? What would a religion freed from androcentrism, equally influenced by women, look like? And this is something I've wondered all my life as well, and especially in the recent years with the struggle to live, breathe, and make a career on your own as a woman, it's all the more difficult. And so I wanted to ask you, what were your thoughts when you wrote this? And what are a few more questions that you would want readers to explore when they're reading Lilith?
I think looking back, I actually felt quite angry when I wrote that. I wrote this book during lockdown. And you know, that was a very, very obviously a very restrictive period. You know, there were long periods where you weren't allowed to. You were, you know, in the UK here, there were times when you were allowed out of your house. You know, you were allowed to go out for one walk a day. You know, it was a very, very restrictive period for a very long time. And I was thinking very deeply about a lot of these things. I was thinking very deeply about this world that we have inherited and what I think is wrong with it. I was thinking about the fact that women have not, you know, had input into all of these things. And then at the top of that, you know, comes this virus that, you know, appears to have evolved from, you know, perhaps from mistreatment of animals, perhaps from not respecting the world as much as we should have. And so that was very much a sort of at the top of my mind when I was writing this book. That sort of idea that is very much there at the beginning of Genesis, that man, and I'm using the word man, is above nature. And, you know, that is something that God explicitly says in Genesis. He explicitly gives the natural world to man to rule. And it, you know, that's mentioned again and again throughout the Bible, that the natural world is man's to rule. And that for me is a big part of a lot of what's gone wrong. We don't rule this world. You know, we happen to be at the top of the food chain. We happen to be, you know, a very successful species, you know, currently. Who knows how long that will go on for. But we don't rule this world. We are part of it. And it's that sort of idea that mankind is separate from the world, above it, you know, that is wrong. we're not above it, we're part of it, and it's our, we should be protecting it and cherishing it and looking after it. So I felt quite angry when I wrote that, and I think I did, rightly or wrongly, I had this idea that these very ancient religions that were inspiring me while I was writing this book, we actually don't know much about what they believe, because nothing is written down. We can only sort of infer things from the artifacts that have been left. And I was thinking very much about Minoan culture, for example. So Minoan culture in ancient Crete is a very sort of gynocentric culture. They worshipped a sort of a nature goddess. All the images that we have from that culture are of female power, of female priestesses, of sort of the joy of life, the art and these beautiful images of people leaping over balls. And I think that's kind of what we've lost. We've lost this reverence of nature. We have lost the idea of being part of this world. We have lost this idea that there's nothing wrong with physicality. Again, I sort of mentioned that earlier religions were very sort of, they didn't have that mind-body separation. The physical was not denigrated and sort of seen as inferior to the spiritual. I think that, arguably, comes from a female point of view, because I think we are more connected to our bodies. Our bodies, we live our lives in cycles. It's impossible for a woman to feel disconnected from her body in the way that men might, because we are so sort of rooted in our bodies. We live life in these cycles. When you're pregnant, when you have children, it's impossible not to be aware of your own physicality. That is you. It's not something separate to you. It is you. You are a physical being. And I think those are just some examples of some things I think we've lost by eliminating the female perspective. And I think that is part of what's gone wrong with the world, in my opinion. I think the world would have been better if we hadn't sort of started conceiving of us as in power over the world, or that our minds are what's important and our bodies are just sort of meat, carcasses that we'll discard at the end of our lives and go on to a sort of an eternal life of splendor without them. I think those are damaging concepts from my perspective.
Absolutely. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we still are told to think about the afterlife, think about something that's bigger and beyond your bodies, your thoughts, and this entire life. This is like you mentioned earlier, that this is a waiting room and there's an afterlife. So, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, we are more rooted to our own bodies than I guess men will ever be, but we're still asked to be shameful of ourselves. But I guess we are moving past that. More and more women are accepting themselves as they are, and they are actually standing up for themselves also. I mean, at this point in time, we have women advocating for period leaves also at this, and that's a very, very good discussion that's come to the front. So I guess we're moving forward. As you mentioned previously, it's going to take a lot of time, but I hope that we do manage to get that kind of equality that we've been striving for so long. And yeah, as a part of my previous question, and to conclude this discussion, I'd like to ask you what are those few questions that you would ask the readers to explore when they're reading Lilith, and what should they ponder on?
I would want people to be sort of left with the idea that to sort of think about, to think about what we've lost by the elimination of sort of the female divinity and female power. Certainly, I would like people to think about. I would like them to question kind of everything in our culture, in our art, in our literature, and ask, everything that we've assumed is universal, to sort of remind people that actually a lot of it is just is the male point of view, and it has been, it has come to us without sort of any sort of female gaze or female input. So I would kind of want people to kind of seek out female creative pursuits. Those voices that we haven't heard so much, and of course we are seeing many now, which is wonderful. So I would want people to do that. I'd want people to question kind of how we got here, I studied history. I am fascinated by history, and particularly ancient history, because I think the answer to anything, pretty much anything in this world, why are things this way? And it's always because of what came before. And you have to keep going back and back and back and back a really long way. I always take a really, really, really big, long view of things. Why are things like this? And it's because of what came before. It's because of the beliefs that came before. It's because of the things people thought before and the way, things were constructed before. So I would like people to be more aware of that. I would like people to be more aware of where misogyny comes from, that it's not natural, it's not innate. Male, patriarchal power, male supremacy, these things were never inevitable. They were choices. There were alternatives, unfortunately, which weren't taken, but we are where we are. And I would like people to question, kind of everything, because it's all, comes from what came before, which is this sort of, this system of belief that says that men have power over women, which, I think is wrong. And, when everything, when it comes to reproductive rights, for example, these are very much, in many parts of the world, which restricted women's access to contraception, which restricted women's access to abortion. The reason for that is because that's what suits men. Women need to control their fertility. Pregnancy and childbirth was immensely dangerous, when we didn't have modern medicine. But even today, it is hugely, it changes your life in every single way. Women need to be able to control how many children they have. Men don't. They can have 1,000 children if they want, and it makes no difference to them. Women, every single child that a woman has, represents a huge sacrifice, an investment in time, the risk to her career, physical risks that may last for the rest of her life, mental risks. And the only reason that our culture doesn't take, any account of this is because it's been viewed as a woman's duty, a service that she provides for men. But it's not. It is a choice, and she should choose whether to do it, and she should choose how many children she has and when she wants to have them, because you have to be able to provide for us. You can't just, women cannot have, relentless amounts of children. They have to choose when they have them and to time them. And, so that, the reason that we have these sort of restrictive laws on abortion and contraception is because men made those laws and it suited men. And they needed, in many cases, to force women to have children when they didn't want to. These are all the things that need to change, because if women had been in power for the past 7,000 years, you absolutely would not have had those laws. Women in the ancient world absolutely controlled their fertility because they had to, because it's a matter of life and death. Women controlled their fertility through herbs, they had contraception, they had means of abortion, and they absolutely practiced it in every society in the world. So it's these sorts of things. I want people to question why we have the rules that we have, the laws that we have, the morality we have, the culture we have. And in every single case, it's because they benefited and suited men.
That makes a lot of sense, honestly. And I think that's a starting point. And if people start thinking on those lines, we'll probably be entering into a better world. And they themselves will change the reality for themselves, and then later on for the women in their lives, and so on and so forth. So, and okay, to end this discussion, what would be your one final message to the Melodionics Book Club readers who are going to pick this book next in February?
Well, I would say read with an open mind. That's all I would say. Read with an open mind. As you can see, I talk a lot about this stuff because it fascinates me. I find it interesting. And some of it, I'm sure, readers will not agree with. Some readers might find enlightening, but other parts they might not agree with and might not like. But all I would say is read with an open mind. Take from it what you will, discard what you will, but be open to different ways of looking at things. I suppose that's it.
That's a very important message. And I think looking at things with an open mind and accepting other ideologies is also a starting point of, entering into a better world, or changing your own thoughts and being open to change is also something that's very important. And thank you so much for having this enlightening discussion with me. I'm sure that when we pick this book up as the book of the month in February at the Melodionics Book Club, I'm sure early readers would look back on this discussion and they'd want more and they would explore more about Lilith and they would definitely read this book.
Oh.
And thank you, fellow readers, for tuning into this conversation. If you haven't read Lilith yet, I would urge you to go to your nearest bookstore and pick this up, because this is a beautiful book. And also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and follow us on Instagram. I'll add Nikki's Insta handle in the description below so that you can follow her as well and stay tuned with whatever she's writing next. And if you like this discussion, give us a big fat thumbs up. I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Alina. Thank you very much.